Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 10. The Paris Rising, the Frankfort Assembly. March 18th, 1852. As early as the beginning of April, 1848, the revolutionary torrent had found itself stemmed all over the continent of Europe by the league which those classes of society that had profited by the first victory immediately formed with the vanquished. In France, the petty trading class and the Republican faction of the bourgeoisie had combined with the monarchist bourgeoisie against the proletarians. In Germany and Italy, the victorious bourgeoisie had eagerly courted the support of the feudal nobility, the official bureaucracy, and the army against the mass of the people and the petty traders. Very soon the united conservative and counter-revolutionary parties again regained the ascendant. In England, an untimely and ill-prepared popular demonstration, April 10th, turned out a complete and decisive defeat of the popular party. In France, two similar movements, 16th April and 15th May, were equally defeated. In Italy, King Bomba regained his authority by a single stroke on the 15th May. In Germany, the different new bourgeois governments and their respective constituent assemblies consolidated themselves, and if the eventful 15th of May gave rise, in Vienna, to a popular victory, this was an event of merely secondary importance, and may be considered the last successful flash of popular energy. In Hungary, the movement appeared to turn into the quiet channel of perfect legality, and the Polish movement, as we have seen in our last, was stifled in the bud by Prussian bayonets. But as yet, nothing was decided as to the eventual turn which things would take, and every inch of ground lost by the revolutionary parties in the different countries only tended to close their ranks more and more for the decisive action. The decisive action drew near. It could be fought in France only, for France, as long as England took no part in the revolutionary strife, or as Germany remained divided, was, by its national independence, civilization, and centralization, the only country to impart the impulse of a mighty convulsion to the surrounding countries. Accordingly, when, on the 23rd of June, 1848, the bloody struggle began in Paris, when every succeeding telegraph or mail more clearly exposed the fact to the eyes of Europe that this struggle was carried on between the mass of the working people on the one hand, and all the other classes of the Parisian population, supported by the army, on the other. When the fighting went on for several days with an exasperation unequaled in the history of modern civil warfare, but without any apparent advantage for either side, then it became evident to everyone that this was the great decisive battle which would, if the insurrection were victorious, deluge the whole continent with renewed revolutions, or, if it was suppressed, bring about an at least momentary restoration to counter-revolutionary rule. The proletarians of Paris were defeated, decimated, crushed with such an effect that even now they have not yet recovered from the blow. And immediately, all over Europe, the new and old conservatives and counter-revolutionists raised their heads with an effrontery that showed how well they understood the importance of the event. The press was everywhere attacked, the rights of meeting and association were interfered with, every little event in every small provincial town was taken profit of to disarm the people, to declare a state of siege, to drill the troops in the new maneuvers and artifices that Cavaignac had taught them. Besides, for the first time since February, the invincibility of a popular insurrection in a large town had proven to be a delusion. The honor of the armies had been restored. The troops hitherto always defeated in street battles of importance regained confidence in their efficiency even in this kind of struggle. From this defeat of the ouvriers of Paris may be dated the first positive steps and definite plans of the old feudal bureaucratic party in Germany to get rid even of their momentary allies, the middle classes, and to restore Germany to the state she was in before the events of March. The army again was the decisive power in the state, and the army belonged not to the middle classes, but to themselves. Even in Prussia, where before 1848 a considerable leaning on the part of the lower grades of officers towards the constitutional government had been observed, the disorder introduced into the army by the Revolution had brought back those reasoning young men to their allegiance. As soon as the private soldier took a few liberties with regard to the officers, the necessity of discipline and passive obedience became at once strikingly evident to them. The vanquished nobles and bureaucrats now began to see their way before them. The army, more united than ever, flushed with victory in minor insurrections and in foreign warfare, jealous of the great success the French soldiers had just attained, this army had only to be kept in constant petty conflicts with the people, and the decisive movement once at hand, it could with one great blow crush the revolutionists and set aside the presumptions of middle-class parliamentarians. And the proper moment for such a decisive blow arrived soon enough. We pass over the sometimes curious, but mostly tedious, parliamentary proceedings and local struggles that occupied, in Germany, the different parties during the summer. Suffice it to say that the supporters of the middle-class interest, in spite of numerous parliamentary triumphs, not one of which led to any practical result, very generally felt that their position between the extreme parties became daily more untenable, and that, therefore, they were obliged now to seek the alliance of the reactionists, and the next day to court the favor of the more popular factions. This constant vacillation gave the finishing stroke to their character in public opinion, and according to the turn events were taking, the contempt into which they had sunk profited for the movement principally to the bureaucrats and feudalists. By the beginning of autumn, the relative position of the different parties had become exasperated and critical enough to make a decisive battle inevitable. The first engagements in this war between the democratic and revolutionary masses and the army took place at Frankfort. Though a mere secondary engagement, it was the first advantage of any note the troops acquired over the insurrection and had a great moral effect. The fancy government established by the Frankfort National Assembly had been allowed by Prussia, for very obvious reasons, to conclude an armistice with Denmark, which not only surrendered to Danish vengeance the Germans of Schleswig, but which also entirely disclaimed the more or less revolutionary principles which were generally supposed in the Danish War. The armistice was, by a majority of 2 or 3, rejected in the Frankfurt Assembly. A sham ministerial crisis followed this vote, but 3 days later the Assembly reconsidered their vote and were actually induced to cancel it and acknowledge the armistice. This disgraceful proceeding roused the indignation of the people. Barricades were erected, but already sufficient troops had been drawn to Frankfort, and after 6 hours' fighting, the insurrection was suppressed. Similar, but less important, movements connected with this event took place in other parts of Germany, Baden, Cologne, but were equally defeated. This preliminary engagement gave to the counter-revolutionary party the one great advantage, that now the only government which had entirely, at least in semblance, originated with popular election, the imperial government of Frankfurt, as well as the National Assembly, was ruined in the eyes of the people. This government and this assembly had been obliged to appeal to the bayonets of the troops against the manifestation of the popular will. They were compromised, and what little regard they might have been hitherto enabled to claim, this repudiation of their origin, their dependency upon the anti-popular governments and their troops, made both the lieutenant of the empire, his ministers, and his deputies henceforth to be complete nullities. We shall soon see how first Austria, then Prussia, and later on the smaller states too, treated with contempt every order, every request, every deputation they received from this body of impotent dreamers. We now come to the great counterstroke in Germany of the French Battle of June, to the event which was as decisive for Germany as the proletarian struggle of Paris had been for France. We mean the revolution and subsequent storming of Vienna, October 1848. But the importance of this battle is such, and the explanation of the different circumstances that more immediately contributed to its issue will take up a portion of the Tribune's columns, as to necessitate it being treated in a separate letter. London, February 1852.